And there you go, your slides are sorted. God. Let's get started so we don't run out of time. Thank you all for coming. This is the first of our, I think we've got 9 planned, don't we, for this semester, including some of the very people in this group too, so you'll get your turn. Thank you for coming along today. I'm Max Boykoff, I'm director of the center here. To start us off, we're really thrilled to have Jessica Smith with us today. She's the co-director of Humanitarian Engineering and assistant professor down the road at Colorado School of Mines. As an anthropologist, her research interests focus around the mining and energy industries, with particular emphasis on corporate social responsibility, engineers, labor, and gender. You can see the title of her talk today. It gets at some of the very projects that she's involved in around mining coal, undermining gender, rhythms of work and family in the American West, the ethics of extraction, integrating corporate social responsibility into engineering education, and other projects. So I think we're off to a great start with you here today, so thank you very much. I have to leave a few minutes before the hour, which I've already apologized about, but Bobby can help facilitate questions up until the top of the hour. Right?
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here. Greetings from the School of Mines. We wanted to briefly just mention Carl Mitchum, who most of you are probably familiar with, is officially retiring from Mines this semester. A distinguished philosopher. He's giving his final lecture at CSM this afternoon at 4 p.m. And you're all welcome to come. It'll be in the ballroom. So thank you. I'm happy to be able to share this research. This is work that was done with my student research team at Mines, with the sponsorship of the ConocoPhillips Center for Sustainable West. The center was founded to support the joint sustainability of water and unconventional energy in the arid West. I'm happy to talk about the participation or lack thereof of ConocoPhillips in the actual research of the question and answer period. But what's really exciting is that not just in the center, but in Mines in general, that we're creating lots of spaces to think about the social dimensions of some of these industries. And specifically, questions of how we can make them more responsible and accountable to the communities that are most impacted by them. So the research I'm sharing today was done with a team. So Skylar Ziliak's there, all the way to the right, graduated with a master's degree in environmental engineering doing this work. We also worked with Austin Schaefer, who was an undergraduate petroleum engineering student, who also did part of our project for us. So as we all know, there have been 2 kind of big developments in Colorado that have shaped the landscape surrounding unconventional energy production. So on the one hand, we have the growing expansion of the Front Range suburbs into areas that historically were oil and gas producing and had the potential to become so again. And at the same time, we have the boom in unconventional energy production, thanks to the twin technologies of hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling. We're able to access resources that previously weren't economical or possible to actually access. What that means is that we increasingly have lots of industry activity very close to where people are living and working and going to school. So there's been significant controversies surrounding that development. And I spend a lot of time talking with engineers in addition to teaching engineering students. And there's this growing consensus that the biggest challenges facing both the mining and the energy industries have to do with questions of compatibility. So if you're going to want to operate in close proximity to people, how can you do that in a way that's socially acceptable to them? So the controversies surrounding unconventional energy in Colorado, as most of us know in this room, have expressed themselves in a debate about state versus local control. So the state has primacy for communities that sought to curtail or stop the expansion of oil and gas activity inside of their boundaries. Many of them passed bans or moratoriums. As we all know, those were struck down last May by the Colorado Supreme Court. So kind of as communities struggle kind of with how to have a greater voice in the permitting process and to be able to have their concerns reflected in how oil and gas activity happens, we see the increasing prevalence of memorandums of understanding. So memorandums of understanding we call supraregulatory because they're not a part of law, that they're not regulation, but they are a legal document that ends up being signed between an operator and the local government, whether that's a town or a county. And what they establish is a set of best management practices that the operator has to comply with. And so those best management practices ideally come out of a negotiation with people in the actual community, and oftentimes involve stricter environmental standards, different sorts of reporting requirements, and kind of a lot of times increased setbacks. So setbacks are the distance between kind of the oil and gas activity and buildings and residences. So far in Colorado, at last check, there were over a dozen of them. We did our case study, our first one, in the first town that passed one, which was Erie, Colorado. We think they're going to become more prevalent as these debates between state and versus local control continue, because they're appealing to industry. So in exchange for complying with this higher set of best management practices, industry gets increased speed and certainty in terms of the permitting process, which can be kind of where a lot of projects get held up. And communities get some sort of say or voice in what activity actually looks like close to them. So our first case study was in Erie, Colorado, located about 45 miles north of Denver. Erie is an interesting place because not only was it the first kind of contemporary memorandum of understanding, but it's really politically diverse. So Erie splits exactly between Boulder and Weld counties, right? So if you could imagine some kind of very extreme views on the industry. So, and this ends up being reflected in how people register to vote. So they're about equally divided between registered Democrats and registered Republicans. Erie is an extremely privileged community. So almost everyone has a bachelor's. Is anybody from Erie? I should have asked. So almost everybody has a bachelor's degree. When you look at census data, lots of professionals. They're very young, they're very white, they have kids in preschool and elementary school when you look at the actual demographics. And they're growing really quickly. So there were only 6,000 people living there in 2005, and then in 2015 there were over 20,000 people. So you can imagine kind of these kind of huge sprawling developments, right, moving out into places where there's historic and also current oil and gas production. So our initial research questions were about the actual MOU process in Erie. And we wondered if having MOUs would increase public trust in government and industry. And we were curious because other social science research that had been done in the Marcellus Shale in Ohio and Pennsylvania showed that when citizens trusted their government, that they had better opinions of oil and gas activity. And so we were curious if that was also happening in Colorado. We wondered what features of MOUs would make them effective in addressing community concerns and in trying to avoid some of the conflict and stalemates, and which sorts of political and social environments would be conducive to having good, effective agreements. So most of the research was done by my graduate student, Skylar. She did both quantitative and qualitative research. So the town of Erie has all of their public hearings online, so she transcribed them and coded them, specifically the public comment section. So what sorts of topics people were raising as issues of concerns, what their expressed opinions were about their government, about industry for the entire time period, so starting in 2010. And I'm going to share some of those results. But kind of that sort of coding analysis is really only part of the story. So it's difficult to tell, for example, what people who aren't kind of coming out to public meetings and making a statement, what they think, and trying to understand some of the backstory behind kind of why people are saying what they're saying. So she also did lots of semi-structured interviews with people in Erie. So she interviewed all of the government officials and then lots of residents on both sides of the issue, plus people who worked for industry. She also engaged in content analysis of the agreements and how they changed over time. And one of the things that she discovered is that in Erie, public comments about the unconventional energy were really bimodal, that they were focused entirely around two super controversial wells. So the first one was the Canyon Creek well in 2011. This well was planned to be 1,500 feet from two different elementary schools, which you can see. It's the schools are here in the green, and that would have been, that was where the well was put in, there in red. So you can imagine being so close to an elementary school that a lot of the people who sent their children there and lived there were very worried about air pollution, water pollution, and human health effects of having industrial activity so close to where their kids were going to be. The kind of outrage about this proposed well was so strong that they ended up with a 6-month moratorium on all oil and gas activity. There was a big grassroots environmental group that became very powerful called Erie Rising. They described themselves as this mom-powered organization that was seeking to kind of protect the health of their children. Thanks. It eventually went through, despite all of the controversy. But one of the legacies of it was that they established the first memorandum of understanding between the operators in the area and the town based on some of their concerns. So that was in 2012. The things were very quiet until late 2014 when the Pratt well happened. We colloquially started referring to this as the disaster well because anything you could imagine going wrong went wrong. So this was a well that was located 800 feet from a neighborhood called Vista Ridge. They were drilling the well. They unearthed a toxic trash landfill, and all of this contaminated trash came up and started blowing around the neighborhood. They encountered unexpected natural gas that they needed to flare, and they flared it following regulations from the state, best practices for industry, but they didn't tell local people about what was happening or why, and so you just got lots of pictures like this one of people taking pictures of these giant flames over the wall and wondering what's happening. This looks terrible, even though it's a standard industry practice. The other thing that happened is that the activities were consistently out of state regulations for noise for weeks, and it was over the holiday season. So Thanksgiving, Christmas, everybody's at home trying to be with their families. They're spending more time at home during the day, right? And all you hear is the clanging. So this was the disaster well. This is when kind of public comment again becomes very prevalent. And keep in mind, this is happening even as this MOU is in place, right? But they were renegotiating that MOU while this was happening. And one of the outcomes of it was a new agreement. And they called it an operator agreement. We can't tell why. They're structurally identical. We're not sure why they have a different term. But that was negotiated and signed in 2015. So once we knew a little bit more about the context of oil and gas development and public comments in Erie, we had some new questions. So how did public opinion change over the course of these two events? How did they change relationships between the local government and the community? How did the MOU process itself change, if at all? And how effective was it in addressing community concerns during these two periods? So first, how did the community react to these two different crises, to these two different problem wells? So this is, sorry it's so small, a chart that shows you what people are talking about in terms of the Canyon Creek controversy. So what you see on the left, these are the number of public comments on a certain topic, which are along the x-axis there. So you can see, for example, that only one person spoke about noise or vibration in this January meeting, so that the bars are also chronological. So kind of within each topic, you can see how it's changing over time. So what you notice is that the big concerns have to do with air pollution and with health. When we compared that with the public comments in the Pratt well, we noticed some significant differences in what people are talking about. So you see noise going from being something mentioned by just kind of one person at 2 meetings to being one of the main things that people are worried about. Concerns about air pollution go down substantially. This is partially because the state came out with a study specifically about Erie and the potential health effects of air pollution being minimal. But you see people are still worried about health, but not to the same extent. And I have, the next slide is going to show them together, but I thought it might be too overwhelming. So this is the same thing, these are all of the same topics, but instead we have all of the meetings for both incidents. So you can see that noise and vibration kind of starts off as kind of very insignificant and then becomes kind of very important during the second Pratt incident. One of the things I wanted to draw your attention to were was the lack of attention to climate change. These. One of the reasons we were coding for climate change is we were interested in if the local people were linking their advocacy to broader critiques of fossil fuels and how much they were a part of wider national anti-fracking movements that have been so prominent. And it's barely a blip. I mean, so when people were talking and opposing the oil and gas industry, it was for very local reasons and localized reasons. So why did the public comments shift over time, even though it's the same community? And in part, it's because the 2 sites raised different concerns. So the Canyon Creek well was just in the permitting phase. It wasn't actually in operation. So people were dealing with some of the very immediate effects of having to live close to these things. So they hadn't experienced noise or light pollution. But we think it's also significant that the topics that decreased in importance from the Canyon Creek incident to the Pratt one were those that have been addressed by the MOU. So when you actually read through the MOU, most of the provisions had to do with minimizing air and water pollution. And so we wondered and asked people in interviews if they felt that the MOU was effective in addressing some of their initial concerns, and they thought so. But at the same time, having that document in place wasn't sufficient to prevent all of the outrage over that Pratt well disaster.
Can I ask you just really quick?
Yeah, sure.
Do you have any meetings that are after the first one was operational?
People didn't talk about it. So,
okay. So once it went in, like it was.
Yeah, there was no public comment for 2 years about anything related to oil and gas. I mean, so people were talking about skateboard parks, but I mean, it was really only kind of in these 2 kind of initial like controversies that people would talk about it. People didn't show up to just.
And then similarly, like the comments here are after, like when Pratt was operational, but there wasn't much discussion of it before.
No, yeah. I mean, one of the things that suggests is that people kind of show up to their local government when there's problems, right? Big ones that other people are talking about. One of the really interesting things that we found, this is probably more interesting, is that there was increased explicit statements of trust of their local government over this whole process. So the blue bars are the Canyon Creek comments, and so what you see is that people are very critical of their government. In general, they're critical of specific people, especially the mayor. They express a lot of mistrust of industry and mistrust of government. When you look at the Pratt incident, which was by any measure much more harmful, much more intrusive, I mean, they're blowing toxic trash right around this neighborhood. you find that people are actually expressing praise for their government, and they're praising specific government officials, and they only had one person who expressed any sort of mistrust of government, even though kind of this disaster is happening. They did, however, express a lot of mistrust of industry, which is that highest orange chart there. So kind of it's this question about how is it that even though you have a well that's arguably worse, that people have a better opinion of their government. And we think a lot of it has to do with how the governing board, it's a board of kind of trustees, how they actually engage the public. So in the Canyon Creek well, there was a lot of antagonism between the elected officials and the citizens who would come to these meetings. So this gentleman, for example, showed up whenever he would give an anti-fracking comment wearing his gas mask, right? I mean, so very dramatic. But the board itself was also really dramatic. So when people, at one point, someone had raised this criticism of a presentation that had happened kind of from industry and had raised a question, and one of the board members started to answer, and the mayor cut him off and said, "Don't engage them," like them referring to all of the activists in the audience. And the citizens also went on the record. Our favorite quote of the whole project was, "You are a feckless coward. I hope your children are proud of you." We have someone speaking to the mayor about his inability to actually govern this industry. The conflict between the board and between the citizens also came out in how they used science. So the mayor would frequently make comments that we just need to let the facts decide. We're going to learn about all of these facts from industry and science, and we're going to have a very rational debate about all of this. And one of the ways that local citizens were able to counter that was some of them put together a bucket brigade to try to do their own science because they didn't trust some of the air quality samples that were coming out. So that was during the first incident. In the second, in the Pratt well, there was a huge turnover in who actually was on that board. So in that period in which there's virtually zero comments about oil and gas activity, there was an election. And in the election, there were 5 open seats. The mayor was also vacated. And so you had a complete almost turnover of who was there. And there was a group of people who ran together on a platform of transparency. And they very much tried to engage the community in a different way. So they ended up putting lots of information and materials on the website. They were much more responsive. So this quote is from one of the interviews that Skylar did, talking about how it used to be difficult to have board members actually respond to emails or respond to calls, but now they actually go so far as to go out to your house if you're complaining about noise or something, to try to understand what's happening. And so it's the election of this board and the way in which they implement the MOU that seems to be more significant than the MOU itself. So this is a chart that shows expressions of public opinion about unconventional energy over time. So the blue bars are people who are expressing anti-fracking sentiments. Red bars are people who are expressing support for the industry, and the green bars are people who are taking some sort of middle ground. And again, what we found so interesting is that in the second period, which is the well that's the most controversial, that people are expressing more favorable opinions of industry, even though they don't trust them, and even though kind of this disaster is unfolding. And so what we think is happening is that it's not just the fact that there's an MOU, right? Because the first MOU was signed back there, and you still had rising public sentiment against the industry. But you have the board turnover, and then there's this process of learning and maybe trust building, which people learn kind of that even though there's this disaster, that their local government is going to work with them to try to make things right. So we also wanted to look at the agreements themselves in terms of what effective agreements might look like. And when we were looking for the literature, we couldn't find other places where MOUs are being used to regulate oil and gas activity. But there's a substantial social science literature on agreements made between mining companies and communities, primarily indigenous communities and Aboriginal communities. And there's lots of really significant differences between the mining and energy industries that raise different sorts of concerns. But there is some resonance in kind of what helps to make effective agreements. So they need to address community concerns, be enforceable, and then meaningfully engage the community. And here, to think more specifically about what good community engagement looks like, we followed research done by Oferchele, who identified kind of 6 standards or 6 components of good community engagement. So that there needs to be stated goals that focus on encouraging and enhancing community participation, that there are structures that will actually engage the community and make it possible, that there's resources to help foster that involvement, and some of those resources need to be dedicated toward kind of leveling disparities in expertise. I mean, so a lot of these debates end up happening in very scientific language, and when that happens, people who don't have access to that aren't viewed as legitimate, right? So there has to be some way in which people can have access to that language in order to express their concerns in that way. That there need to be processes for community involvement, and that the validity of the town's interests and concerns are recognized. So when we looked through both agreements, the first MOU was good in terms of addressing community concerns when we looked at kind of what the main concerns expressed in the public comments were against what ended up showing up in the MOU, especially in terms of air pollution. The question of enforceability is an open one that I'd be very happy to chat about, and I'm going to speak more specifically about it in the 2015 one since it got updated. But the community engagement also kind of left a lot to be desired. In terms of the second renegotiated agreement, it also addressed community concerns. So one of the things looking at those topics, we saw that things like noise and lights and setbacks became much more important to people as they were living so close to these installations, and those were included in the second agreement. But the question of enforceability is only slightly better. I mean, so one of the kind of shortfalls of this sort of policy tool is that it's not regulation, and so even though the companies and the towns kind of set these best management practices that the industry says that it's going to abide by, if they don't, it's not clear that the COGCC, so the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission, if they will actually enforce or investigate them. And they've been in both interviews and on the public record saying that their job is to enforce state regulations, not those that are privately agreed upon. And so local governments really don't have the ability and resources to do the same sorts of inspections that they do. But what does make the 2015 agreement better is that there's a stipulation that says that if either party fails to abide by the contract, that they can take each other to court, which was missing in the first one. I think perhaps most concerning for us is the way in which the latest agreement and then others we've been seeing pop up changes the ways in which people participate in the permitting process. So without an MOU, kind of people show up to a public hearing, like the kind that we transcribed and coded, and have their comments put on the public record in that way. In this MOU, what happened is that once the MOU was passed and approved, all public comment moves to these neighborhood meetings that are hosted by industry in private locations or in schools. And they're very much set up kind of like a science fair. So if you can imagine a bunch of, has anybody been to one? Yeah. So they're set up like a U, and they have each topic, each table is dedicated to a particular topic. So if you have a question about safety, you can go to the safety table. If you have a question about frac fluids, you can go to the frac fluids table. And so there's positives and negatives, right? So some of the positives is that people have an opportunity to directly interact with someone right? And have their questions asked and have an actual conversation instead of just kind of standing up and saying your piece. But there's substantial downfalls, right? I mean, so it gets rid of the opportunity for people to stand and have their comments heard in public. It kind of takes out the direct relationship between people and their elected officials. And in terms of the Erie Agreement, they actually included that if people had comments that they wanted included in the public record, that they had to write them out on a 3.5 by 5 index card and put them into this lockbox, and then the lockbox would be taken to the COGCC, and then we all trust that somehow they end up on the permit. And it's not just in Erie. We were looking at one in Adams County, and if the second you have this MOU, I mean, all of the public comments about oil and gas activity kind of just drop off because they get kind of channeled elsewhere. So in terms of thinking about this part of the research, it's clear that public opinion did change over time, that it became less polarized, and that people did express more favorable opinions about oil and gas activity, and specifically about their local government, even though their trust in industry did not go up, which is academically interesting, as well as practically interesting. But we thought that the agreements themselves would have been the impetus for some of these changes, but it's clear that alone that they aren't, that it was really how they were being implemented by which particular kind of elected officials, so that in this part it was really the board that was committed to transparency and more respectfully engaging community members. That was the big difference. And we see lots of areas for growth and improvement in terms of how these agreements end up handling community engagement. So that part of the research is focused on how local people in towns experiencing oil and gas development engage with their local government. But that's not the only kind of method. There's also relationships and opportunities for people to engage state agencies, specifically the COGCC. And the most prevalent way is through their complaint system. So in the complaint system, you register very specific complaints about specific wells that they then have to investigate and then share the results of their investigation. So we were curious if having an MOU in place would change the ways in which people engaged that formal state system. If they would increase that use or decrease it, or change what people talked about. So the way that we couldn't just do it over time because there weren't enough complaints before kind of the MOUs were in place. We couldn't do it before and after. So instead what we did was we compared Erie with Firestone, which is a nearby community that is demographically not identical but very similar. So kind of slightly lower median income and slightly lower education rates, but very similar racial and ethnic distribution. And what we found was a really big difference in the complaints that people were making to the COGCC in these two areas for this time period. So you'll notice in Firestone that the content of the complaints is varied. So people are using it to talk about everything from noise, which is the biggest category for both of those, to land damages, to air quality, to aesthetics. People also use the complaint system to just ask if the well is producing and how much. So that's in Firestone, kind of without an MOU. In Erie, you see that almost everybody is using it to talk about noise, and almost everyone is using it to talk about the Pratt well. So out of 59 total complaints, 47 of them were specific to that one well. And so if you were to take those out to get a better sense of kind of just how things were going over time, you'd see that there would be fewer complaints, but that when there was a big controversial well, that people used this system to register their concerns. We wanted to make sure that it wasn't just because there were different levels of drilling activity that there were different levels of complaints. So we tracked drilling activity, and there aren't correlated with the number of complaints that people are making. They're very similar for both of them. that Erie in 2012 would have been similar if there wouldn't have been the moratorium. That it actually has more to do with where the drilling is happening instead of how much of it. So these are heat maps of where drilling is happening from 2010. Those are the blue kind of parts. And then in 2011, the drilling activity you see with the green shading. And then 2012, you can see the red. And so one of the things that you notice in looking where these things are actually being drilled is that they come very, very close to Erie and Firestone in 2012. Instead of being kind of on the outskirts, they're much closer to the actual towns themselves. And that's the year in which the complaints peaked. You can see it also in 2014, they move way out, so they're not by people anymore. This is a summary of them. So it seems that kind of the level of complaints is more closely related to where the wells are instead of kind of how much drilling is happening. So what we saw was that kind of the complaints were much more homogeneous in topic and less frequent in the MOU context in Erie. So it seems that one potential reason might be that citizens were preferring to engage their local government instead of the state one. But at the same time, citizens who were living in Erie used the complaint process when the controversy did arise. And that's potentially because they realized the limits of local government. I mean, so their local government can't actually go out and inspect and shut wells down in the same way that the COGCC does. And just kind of looking at the tenor of the complaints that were made in Erie, people were citing very specific regulations about noise instead of just saying that the thing is noisy. So it seemed like there had been kind of a learning process about some of these rules and regulations and perhaps some sort of concerted effort to kind of put it on the COGCC's radar. So in terms of our future research, one of the big limitations is that so far it's just one case, just Erie. Erie is kind of unique in how privileged it is. And so our next team is working on less privileged communities. So we're looking at Commerce City and unincorporated Adams County, and of what memorandums of understanding, how that process looks like and how and if they affect public perceptions of industry. One of the reasons why we're wondering if working in a more socioeconomically diverse place makes a difference is because in Erie, there's definitely this sense that people were represented by a local government full of people who looked and acted like them, right? So they lived next to them, similar levels of education. They felt that they had a voice in their government, and they felt entitled to criticize it, right? To come out and call the mayor a feckless coward in front of everybody. In places that aren't full of such privileged people, there might be a bigger difference between kind of the people who are experiencing the effects of oil and gas development and their elected officials. And then there might be less time to actually engage in the public process, because it takes a lot to show up to a hearing for 2 hours and sit there and kind of have your comments put on the public record. We also continue to be interested in the role that science plays and how these debates play out on a local level, and the extent and to which ways people in the public use science-based arguments instead of kind of more general ones. And then lastly, think about ways in which community engagement could be made a little bit more meaningful, given some of the big limitations that we've identified. So we have 2 papers that have come out on this so far. We have 2 more that are currently being revised and resubmitted. I'm happy to share those, and I'm happy to take questions as well. Thank you very much. Yeah.
I was wondering if, when you were looking at the public comments, if there was any correlation between the advocacy language that was out there, whether by industry or environmental organizations. You know, it went from water to air to setbacks. So I don't know if you can look at that.
And what the advocacy language, if it changed or what it looked
Well,
like?
so the
or-
advocacy language changed, but did the public comments follow that? So were people maybe learning different concerns? You know, you were saying like at first noise wasn't an issue or setbacks
Right.
wasn't an issue. And so was there any change there? Or
I,
maybe you didn't look at that.
my own kind of personal view that we haven't been able to kind of prove is that I think people learned how to make arguments that were winnable, right? So instead of making kind of general quality of life arguments, that they learned to be able to attack very specific regulations, right? So we can go after them on this instead of making a very broad kind of statement against industry.
I was at the Lafayette public hearing
Oh, wow.
last week,
Yes.
and so there, the townspeople and some of the members of city council are kind of jumping over the understanding agreement and moving toward trying to legalize direct action in response to drone coming into the county.
Oh, wow.
And I was wondering if in the communities that you've been working with, whether that frustration with those understandings, if you're seeing any conversations about that, or what your thoughts are on.
Not that I heard. I mean, these are places that wanted to avoid very extreme stances on either way. So they were much more kind of compromise focused than kind of coming out in that way.
I was just curious, it seems like I'm not sure if that's representative of other, I know areas in Pennsylvania and Oregon have tried this direct action legalization, but I was, just curious how far you see it going.
Yeah, I think it would really depend on the specific town, right? And who all is engaged and who's the most vocal. I mean, the other thing that we discovered was that the town of Erie had a big budget crisis, so they were also interested in having, right, all of the kind of economic payments from kind of this sort of activity. So they kind of had a vested interest in making it work instead of trying to shut it down entirely. Yeah. Yes, sir.
So one of the research questions was to figure out if how MOUs affect how the public uses the complaint system.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if that depends on how, if at all, the complaint system is addressed in the content of the MOU. And I don't know because I haven't read these things, but if really good, effective MOUs could actually include them, if industry actually commits to the public and said, look, if you have serious concern about what we're doing, there is a complaint system that goes directly to the Colorado Commission for Oil and Gas,
Right.
and we will take these complaints seriously.
Well, and that's a really interesting question. And what I didn't mention is kind of the broader context of the complaint system. So there are lots of companies on the Front Range that would prefer that people not call the state, that they call them directly. So lots of them have kind of direct hotlines. So instead of calling the COGCC, right, you call Anadarko, and then they kind of track all of these things and keep care of it. So I think that I didn't see where the MOU specifically directed people to use a complaint system, but it seems that the companies that are being more progressive in terms of trying to work with people are trying to privatize, right, and then kind of keep things in-house instead of involving the state. Yeah.
Have different operators taken different approaches to MOUs? Is there any significant difference between Anadarko and Noble or some of the smaller ones that sometimes get accused of being less responsible?
That's a great question. And so one of the things I didn't talk about, because I didn't want to get into the weeds, but the first agreement, the first MOU that was signed, the two big operators were Anadarko and Encana. And so the town side MOUs with both of them separately, even though they were identical. When it came time for the MOUs to be renegotiated, they only signed with Encana because they didn't think they needed it with Anadarko anymore because they viewed them as more trustworthy and responsible. And so they only signed it with Encana, which was the same company that was in charge of that disaster well. So I haven't talked to officials from many of the other companies, but most of them have said that, I mean, the good thing is that there's increased certainty, increased clarity in terms of expectation, so that it's a good thing for them. But I think the smaller companies probably would not have the same sorts of resources, right, to make sure that they're written in a way that's acceptable to them. And it seems that it's the companies that are bigger, right, and have kind of enough kind of people to actually work on them. Yeah.
I like your future research questions. I guess I'm still pondering the last one about meaningful engagement. I wonder if you had any initial thoughts or hunches or observations about meaningful cases, what you experienced here, approximating an answer at this stage.
We're still just beginning to think about it. I mean, I think one of the challenging things, I mean, and so my background is mostly in mining. So this is my first project in oil and gas. But so most of the agreements that we were also comparing kind of ours with were for mines. And so if you imagine kind of there's one mine, I mean, it changes a little bit and grows and expands, but it's kind of one big intensive place, and there's kind of communities around it. One of the things that makes oil and gas development so tricky is that it's more spatially extensive, right? So there's a well here and a well there, and kind of all of this different infrastructure. And so one of my worries is that by doing this on kind of this neighborhood by neighborhood basis, right, that there aren't opportunities kind of for a town together, right, to come and talk about what this means. And I didn't include some of Skylar's graphs, but when you look at who the public commenters are, it's very much like based on a neighborhood basis. So the people who came out to talk about the Pratt well were people from that neighborhood. It wasn't kind of the town in general. And so that seems like a really big challenge in terms of addressing an industry that is kind of so spatially extensive and influences lots of different people, but at different times, right? So I think that's one of the biggest challenges. I don't know, I mean, the neighborhood meetings, I mean, they're easy for anthropologists to poke fun at in terms of them being kind of these rituals of responsibility, right, and kind of a performance of industry to people. But there's lots of good about them. So I don't think the answer is getting rid of the neighborhood meetings, but making sure that you also don't lose some of this more kind of public collective space kind of to grapple with an industry that's affecting your whole town. Yeah.
Yeah, that leads into the idea of enforcement, right? Because the issue with the community meeting is if it doesn't leave any power to do anything. So
Right.
how did you find that process or see any indication of that really having been a valuable addition to
The neighborhood meeting?
well, you had that little kind of 100 squares chart with the X's and checks. And
Yeah.
like, oh, they added an enforcement measure, and then we have this complaint system. And did that create a feedback loop where community meetings, complaint system, and enforcement contract could actually have fixed the power dynamic there? What do you
I think the enforcement would be key, right? Because, I mean, the question is if you spend all of this time negotiating an agreement and you say kind of what your requirements are kind of for industry to exist, and they end up not complying with it, right? And then the COGCC doesn't do anything to actually enforce them, right? Then that undoes any of the trust that was built.
And have you seen that? And have you seen that as a useful addition already? Has there been indication like, oh, this actually made a difference by putting that in there?
That's a really great question. And I haven't seen people speak specifically about the enforcement issue. I've seen some blogs of people who are outspoken on one side or the other saying that it's a good thing, or kind of it's just a facade, that what really needs to happen is the COGCC needs to enforce them. instead of just being able to sue each other. The interesting thing is that even though we thought that the MOUs were so exciting, kind of as this governance tool, when we actually talked with people who lived there, the opinion was really ambivalent about whether or not they were effective. And so to me, it's interesting that even though people are ambivalent about them, it's changing the way that they're thinking and kind of commenting about things. Yeah.
It's kind of a follow-up on the enforcement issues. Like, there's a lot of things that are part of these MOUs as the best management practices that are not in the purview of the COTCC to enforce. Like, they don't have a legal mandate to enforce them. Like the traffic regulations that a lot of people add in because of the deterioration of the roads, heavy trucks and whatnot. They can't do anything about that. That's a local issue. They can't do anything. So there's got to be some kind of a balance between what the local people can do to enforce and what the COTCC does to enforce. And if it goes above and beyond the actual state law, they're not mandated to do that either.
Right.
So it's kind of, enforcement's really interesting.
Well, and it would have to happen on a couple of different levels.
Yeah.
Right?
And you also need resources to do that as well.
Yep.
Both state and local.
Exactly.
It's a bit of a conundrum.
It is. Yeah.
Are the operators really, in the MOUs you've seen, or operator agreements, are they really giving anything away? I mean, they don't, the way I understand it, there's no incentive for them other than sort of the nebulous social license to operate.
They do have a real concrete incentive in terms of the permitting time decreases, right? So instead of having your permit or application for a well take a couple of months, right, it would be more on the scale of weeks. So you have greater certainty. One of the critiques of the MOUs is that they enshrine best practices that companies were already saying that they were doing. I don't know if in your review of some of the other ones, if you've seen anything totally off the wall and kind of above and beyond what would be required. I mean, ours seemed fairly kind of run of the mill. I mean, they did ask for increased setbacks.
Yeah, that also passed as a law too.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's a valid question. But the thing about a lot of the best management practices and the corporate social responsibility stuff of companies going above and beyond, it was always out of their goodwill, right? So now at least if you have it in a contract that you can bring to a legal system, it would be more enforceable instead of people just saying we're doing this because we're being nice.
And I used to work on regulatory stuff, and that certainty that you just mentioned is really important, and it's really like years sometimes to get permits. So like that is a huge thing for them. So they're willing to trade a lot for that certainty.
Exactly.
Are they really trading anything?
So what
So
are they
they're
trading?
getting that.
If it's not enforced, they're.
But what are they
they're
giving
writing
up,
much of stuff
right?
down and
Well,
that's it.
but the ability to be sued is also a big deal for them.
True story.
Many of these actually go to court.
Not that I've seen. I don't know if
I
I've
haven't
seen
seen
any.
And there are also MOUs before the one in Erie too.
Yeah, so there's one in La Plata County.
Yeah, and they've had a ton of MOUs.
These are different kind of in their structure. So my understanding of the ones in La Plata County was you had to have a new MOU for every well. And so
Right.
this kind of covers an agreement between an operator and a town. So you don't have to redo it for every single one.
Right.
For your future research, do you think there'll be a difference between, like you were mentioning, in terms of the community engagement? You know, mine is this huge thing, and it's a big hole in the ground that's there for decades, and it
Right.
takes probably a decade or more just to get the thing going. And
Right.
so, like, there's that time difference where this is happening faster, but then
Exactly.
most of what you see is gone after the well is drilled, but there's still some stuff there for a long time. I mean, it seems like there's more ongoing engagement for mining than there is for oil and gas. Or, I don't
That
know.
was my thought too. But when you actually look, I mean, so companies like Anadarko will put out, they actually publish the results of their grievance hotline, and they categorize them based on kind of where and what the topic was. Most of their inquiries actually come from producing wells. So ones that are already existing, maybe less intrusive, that they're actually much more work than you might expect. And I was surprised by that because I thought it would be drilling would be the most kind of intrusive. But really kind of most of their kind of actual community engagement was on the producing.
Is that because people can ask if it's producing, and is the landowner asking, should I be getting royalties?
I don't know, but they also have to do like workovers, right? So like if it stops producing, they have to bring in another rig. Yes.
So at the beginning, you said that you weren't sure what the difference was between the MOU and the operator agreement because structurally they were very similar. But then after your presentation, especially when you presented the matrix, you showed that the operator agreement is actually enforceable in ways that the MOU is. So that's one difference.
Yeah.
Right? I wonder if another difference, and since we seem to have our regulatory expert right here, if the title of the document implies something, memorandum of understanding, when I see that language, I see it as two parties coming into agreement on something, so they're kind of equally responsible and accountable to each other. The operator agreement seems to put the burden on the operator.
That's interesting.
And in a way, the operator comes and said, "This is what I agreed to do for you," to make sure that
That could be.
Is anybody?
Well, there's a million lawyers in all of this, so that could be it. I don't know. I mean, yeah, I don't know. Operator agreement doesn't trigger, in my memory, any like specific regulatory thing, but.
Well, and we asked. I mean, so we asked all of the trustees, and they said they didn't know.
Couldn't it also be that the MOU, the first one, didn't really work very well? And so they wanted to rename it to give it sort of a fresh start.
That could be
Semantically. Like, we don't want to tie, we don't want to have another MOU, because that's, it's
Right.
negative now.
Right.
Has it all been all municipalities doing MOUs?
There's also counties.
Counties also?
Yeah.
How about something below that? Could a community, a neighborhood that the rest of this town and county doesn't agree with, could they come up with their own MOU?
Hypothetically. I mean, so that's also the big difference between the existing agreements between kind of big mines and communities. Those are signed kind of with a lot of times indigenous communities, not with like governments. I mean, so it's their own government, but kind of not a state. The MOUs in Colorado are all being signed with kind of government entities, kind of not with kind of smaller associations. I don't know. I haven't heard any talk about if anybody would be interested in doing that.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I know that their COGCC has MOUs too with some towns and some operators as well. And then their interagency, COGCC and like BLM, for example,
Right.
have MOUs as well in place to govern oil and gas. So there's different types of MOUs too.
Just to twist this around, could a community decide they want to attract oil and gas and write a less restrictive MOU?
Exactly, that'd be the worry, right? Is that, and where do you actually define the bounds of a community, right? So,
I don't think you could do that.
No.
Legally, state
The state
law
should
would
come
not let
in
you
and
know.
can't go below
prevent it.
and actually you can't go below EPA's, for different regs, and so you can't go below.
What EPA?
Yeah.
Now who knows?
on that note, yeah.
This is a little outside of your direct research, but you were talking before about people were learning to make more pointed comments like specific policy related complaints, which I was just wondering if you know or thought much about for those people that don't have the specific policy related complaints, but maybe they're not right next to the whatever the mine or the drilling station, but they just have the idea that they don't want that in their community and want to take some sort of ownership over what their community accepts, which was the opposite of what you just brought up, of course. But what are the existing mechanisms for moving on from just whatever the local community might be sort of angry about having that there to take that on to a state level?
What do you mean? What
Just
kind of?
take on the idea that we don't want this in our community. That how can they express that less direct policy complaint and have that carry on and just further than personal frustration.
I'm not sure. I mean, it
Yeah.
seems, what's that?
Yeah, just the idea of if their general complaint about tracking the thing.
Maybe go to the legislature and kind of get some of the laws.
I mean, you could say that, of course, for every single industry, like, has an individual who might benefit from the
Right.
industry itself. Like, it's, yeah.
I mean, I think the people who are really savvy kind of are trying to kind of go after very specific, right, regulations in order to try to bring about some of the changes that they want. So I haven't done enough work on the social movements themselves to see kind of how they translate kind of into specific forms of policy activism. So I'm not sure.
So if anyone else has any questions, it is 1 o'clock.
Yeah,
So I
thank
think
you.
we're gonna formally